So we've talked quite a bit about theories so far, and we're still going to keep touching on it as we go, as you'll see in the next episode. But now we're going to start getting into some more genre-specific stuff. It only seems natural to start with what is probably the most widely studied subject in folkloristics, folktales. Because there's so much about folktales I want to cover, this video is going to be split into 2 main episodes, and we might still come back to it again later on. For now, though, let's start with reviewing some key terms. Now, we talked a bit about folktales as being a form of oral literature way back in the genres video, and if you haven't seen that one yet, you might want to catch up. Now, folktales are sometimes referred to as Märchen, which is German for wonder tale. You might also know them as fairy tales, but most folklorists don't like to use that term because, well, not all Märchen involve fairies. Now, as you might remember from the genres video, folktales can be distinguished from other forms of oral literature in a few main ways. They are always understood to be fictional, they tend to feature magical events, objects, or characters, and they can be told by anybody in the community, although they are usually only told by those who are recognized as being particularly skilled storytellers. Now, one of the most important characteristics of any kind of folklore, but in storytelling in particular, is that it reflects the way we think the world works. Now, this reflection is going to change depending on who's telling the story, who's in the audience, and even who's collecting that story to be published in a book later on. As we know from looking at the history of folklore in the 3rd and 4th videos of this series, plenty of folklorists, especially those early scholars of the 1800s, like to alter the oral tales they collected in order to prevent them from offending the sensibilities of the upper middle class who would be reading those stories once they were published. Even the Brothers Grimm, who are widely credited as having published the original tales, are known to have done this, especially in their later collection. Now, objectively, these altered and transcribed versions of folktales are no better or worse than their verbal counterparts. They're just different. All storytellers and collectors are going to take some creative liberties. Now, this is important to remember when studying folktales because you can extrapolate all sorts of information about the story itself and the people involved in the telling based on, you guessed it, context. There's our favorite word again. The text of the story alone can't tell you everything you need to know. The context of folktales is also a great demonstration of how folklore is both conservative and dynamic. Oh, delicious paradoxes. Because different people are going to alter a story slightly with each new retelling, you're going to get lots of different versions. Though all those different versions may be based on the same or similar aesthetics. In fact, according to Freudian folklorist Alan Dundes, a folktale isn't a folktale unless there are multiple versions. I just love saying that. Freudian folklorist, who knew that was something you could be? Now, since folktales have to have multiple different versions to be folktales, and since there are so many different recognized versions of each tale, we have to have a way of keeping track of all those stories. It's kind of like collecting trading cards. It's a heck of a lot easier to keep them organized when you keep them in a binder instead of in a shoebox. This is where the Arne Thompson-Uter index comes in. Uther, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I sure hope I am. Now, the ATU index, I'm not going to call it by its full name anymore because it's just too hard to say, is a numbering system created specifically to sort all those folktales into different types. It's combined with the motif index in order to provide the most comprehensive and cross-cultural typology of folktales as possible. And it gets altered every so often, and they keep adding the names of different contributors, like until fairly recently it was still just called the AT index instead of the ATU. Before we move on though, some definitions. First of all, what on earth is a tale type? Tale type is the general pattern that a folktale follows. For example, the Sleeping Beauty tale type, ATU 410, encompasses many different stories about a princess who falls into an enchanted sleep and is then woken by a creeper who likes kissing unconscious women. Whereas the Disney movie, for example, represents only one version of ATU 410. So keep that in mind. Tale types are made up of a variety of single versions of tales that all have more or less the same plot and motifs. Motifs are recurring images and themes found throughout both oral and written literature. In the case of folktales, these motifs are often shared between stories of the same type. So Cinderella is the tale type, but the infamous Lost Slipper is the motif. Now, we're going to talk more about the theory of folktales next week, so for now, let's move on to something I'm sure most of you have been wondering since the start of this video. Why do we tell folktales? Well, there's lots of different theories. Because they follow particular formats and patterns, because they involve a certain kind of journey, because they help alleviate childhood fears and anxieties about growing up, because they reflect our life cycles, experiences, beliefs, values, and ideals, both on a personal level and that of the community as a whole, and because they help alleviate everyday stress by providing a temporary escape from it. Well, it's probably a combination of all those and more, so let's take a look at the ones I've just listed in a little bit more detail. Because they follow certain formats and patterns, one of the most prominent characteristics of folktales is that they follow certain verbal patterns. Formulaic phrasing is a big one. I mean, we all know about Once Upon a Time and They All Lived Happily Ever After, but there are other formulaic patterns too. Many folktales will repeat whole sections pretty much verbatim, just like in the Three Little Pigs or Little Red Riding Hood. Little pigs, please let me in. Not by the hairs of our chinny chin chin. Repeat 3 times. Now most people today find this repetition kind of annoying. So why is it such a major part of how we tell folk tales? Well, mostly because it benefits the storyteller. It's important to remember that even though most of us are familiar with folk tales from like books and film adaptations, for most of human history they weren't usually written down. The use of repetition and formulaic phrasing is a mnemonic device, or memory aid, that is often used by verbal storytellers to help them remember exactly how a story is supposed to go, because they involve a certain kind of journey. In particular, the journey from childhood to adulthood and from dependence to independence, but lots of other kinds too. For example, the journey from poverty to wealth. Now, almost invariably, the protagonists of folktales start out in their parents' house, having maybe just reached the age where they would start going out on their own and having their own families. However, in order to achieve independence from their parents, they have to first prove themselves worthy of having adult responsibilities and privileges. That is to say, house, spouse, and dollar bills. Now, these journeys tend to differ somewhat between male and female protagonists, which is often a criticism modern people have against folktales, but you also have to consider the dates on most of the written collections that people give this authority to. Victorian era. Yep. Now, the processes might be a bit different. Males tend to gain independence by leaving home, completing a quest, winning the heart of a princess and/or the approval of her father, and thus climbing up a few rungs on the social ladder. Whereas females tend to have to get married to achieve some semblance of independence. Usually through her own cunning and resourcefulness, though often many such tales also reward general virtuousness. Essentially, though, protagonists have to move through a series of stages in order to earn their final reward. Stage 1, something happens to the protagonist to upset their current way of life. Parent dies, someone gets on the bad side of a witch, spirit, fairy, dragon, elf, whatever. Stage 2, the protagonist must go through a trial or a series of trial in order to prove their worth, slay a monster, solve a puzzle or a riddle, find a magic object, and so on. Stage 3, win the heart of a potential partner. And Stage 4, get married, claim their reward, achieve adult status, and thereby restore their life to a happy and stable state. Because they help alleviate childhood anxieties about growing up. I've talked before in this series about how folktales are not necessarily intended specifically for children, and that is still true. However, by virtue of focusing on the journey from childhood to adulthood, folktales can also help reassure kids that they too can make the intimidating shift from carefree child to responsible adult. Everyone has to face different challenges in life. Now, granted, most people don't have to slay a literal dragon or break an actual curse or ask a princess out on a date. But if the generic protagonist of any given folktale can overcome such a crisis, surely you can get through the everyday problems. It can also help teach kids that bad people always get their comeuppance and good people are always rewarded in the end. Now, this may or may not be literally true. It's certainly a simple approach to a complex existence, but it does seek nicely to the next point on our list, because folktales reflect our life cycles, experiences, values, ideals, and beliefs, both on a personal level and on that of the entire community. The idea that good people get rewarded and bad people get punished is what most cultures tend to value in terms of a moral code. Other recurring things in folktales, like getting married and starting a family, or encouraging different patterns of behavior in males and females, are also reflective of the things that different communities tend to value. As I mentioned before, many people tend to refer to Victorian-era collections, namely the Grimms, when they criticize the values that folktales tend to promote. This is, again, why we need to consider context. In fact, why not conduct an experiment of your own? Ask your friends or family to tell you a folktale-like story and see what they come up with. Chances are your contemporary friends will come up with stories that reflect contemporary values. And the final thing on our list about why folktales? Escapism. One thing you might have noticed about folktales, aside from being set in a world that is completely separate from reality, is that there's not a whole lot in the way of character development. Now, this is partly because folktales are traditionally told orally and there's only so many details you can remember without having to write stuff down, but also because purposely keeping the main characters vague allows both the teller and the listener to imagine themselves in the place of the hero. This helps the participants in the telling of a folktale to leave their normal lives behind for a while, just like we do with books and movies and video games. Compound that with the fact that many of the people who traditionally participated in the telling of folktales lived in poverty. Well, this telling of stories to escape everyday stresses may well have helped keep many struggling people sane. So that's where we're going to leave this discussion for today. We're going to pick up again next week when we talk a little bit about the theory behind studying folktales and how folklorists use these theories to analyze tales. This has been an episode of the Folklore Tree. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.